3 children, a house in the suburbs, and a woman who has waited for him for 10 years. That wasn't the life of a stranger. That was the secret world my fiancé built using the very money I earned. I am Denise. And 21 days before my dream wedding, I realized I wasn't the bride. I was the benefactor. It all started when a trembling old woman appeared at my door in the middle of the night. She didn't come for pity. She looked me dead in the eye, her hands shaking as she held out photos of 3 children with faces identical to my future husband's. Then she whispered words that chilled me to the bone. My daughter isn't the homewrecker. She was the first victim, and you are the one he chose to bankroll the lie. In that moment, my perfect world as a tech executive collapsed. I wasn't just betrayed by emotion. I was betrayed by a cold, calculated system of deception that was nothing short of disgusting. He needed my 6-figure income and my clean, legal profile to act as a prestigious front for his rotting secret family. But that old woman had one final secret, a truth so horrifying that it made 10 years of cheating look like just the tip of the iceberg. Don't turn away, because what you're about to hear isn't a story of heartbreak. This is a high-stakes game of intellectual chess. The final twist will show you never play games with a woman who has nothing left to lose, but has all the intelligence to burn down everything you've ever built. My name is Denise, and at 38 years old, I had finally mastered the art of the perfect trajectory. As a technical program manager for one of the leading firms in the American tech corridor, my life was a series of successfully closed loops, high-stakes deployments, and meticulously managed risks. The glass walls of my Seattle apartment acted as a silent barrier between me and the rest of the world, reflecting the soft amber glow of recessed lighting and the shimmering city lights below. I sat on my Italian leather sofa, the weight of a long, productive day still clinging to my shoulders, and twisted the 3-carat designer engagement ring on my left hand. In exactly 21 days, I was slated to marry Marcus. He was everything a woman of my standing was supposed to want: a man of equal ambition, possessing a steady gaze and a professional reputation as polished as his Oxford shoes. The silence of my sanctuary was broken not by a crash, but by a sound so mundane it felt invasive: a knock at the door. When I rose and peered through the security camera, I didn't see a threat or a face I recognized. Instead, I saw a frail, elderly woman standing in the hallway. She looked small against the vast modern corridor, her coat dampened by the relentless rain, her shoulders hunched as if under the weight of an invisible burden. As the door swung open, the sterile sandalwood-scented air of my apartment met the damp, cold scent of the outside world. The woman didn't move. She stood there, her hands clasped tightly over a faded leather handbag, her eyes scanning my face with a mixture of pity and resolve. She didn't scream or break into tears. Her voice was thin but steady, a haunting whisper that cut through the hum of my climate-controlled home. She spoke of a man who lived in a quiet, leafy suburb just 2 hours to the south, a man who didn't spend his weekends at tech conferences or solo retreats in the mountains. She described her daughter who had been his partner for over a decade. She spoke of 3 grandchildren she clearly adored who lived in a house with a wraparound porch and a swing set in the backyard. She knew the names of the children's pediatricians and their specific food allergies. The oldest boy's reaction to strawberries, the middle girl's asthma triggers. She spoke about the rhythm of their lives, how Marcus always arrived on a Tuesday evening with a specific brand of sourdough bread, and how he spent every Sunday morning coaching a local youth league before disappearing for work on Monday. She wasn't describing a messy affair or a momentary lapse in judgment. She was describing a parallel architectural reality that had been maintained with the same level of discipline and resource management that I applied to my billion-dollar projects. I looked at my engagement ring, then back at the woman's weathered face, and I realized that every late-night deployment Marcus had claimed was actually a scheduled block in a different life. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had engineered a dual existence so flawlessly that I had been paying for the very air his other family breathed without ever knowing they existed. What she described didn't sound like a betrayal of the heart. After the old woman left my apartment, leaving behind a heavy silence and a stack of weathered photographs, I didn't collapse into tears or reach for a bottle of wine. In my line of work, when a system crashes, you don't mourn the lost data, you begin the post-mortem. I sat at my mahogany desk, the cold glow of my dual monitors illuminating the room, and I opened my digital life. For years, I had prided myself on my organizational skills, my ability to track 1,000 moving parts across time zones and continents. Now I turned that analytical engine on my own life. I pulled up my shared calendar with Marcus, the one we used to coordinate our busy, high-powered lives, and I began to layer it against the timeline the grandmother had whispered to me. It was a brutal clinical exercise. Every server migration that required him to be offline for 48 hours, every emergency site visit to the satellite office, and every one of his non-negotiable solo retreats for mental clarity. They all had a new, terrifying context. I cross-referenced the dates of his supposed business trips with the birthdays of his children and the anniversaries mentioned by the old woman. The synchronization was flawless. It wasn't just that he had cheated, it was that he had treated our relationship like a series of scheduled blocks in a master calendar. I saw the patterns now, the cold efficiency of a man who managed two separate worlds with the same precision I used to launch a software product. There were no overlaps, no accidental slips, because he had optimized the logistics of his deception to fit perfectly into the gaps of my demanding career. He knew exactly when I would be in board meetings and when I would be too exhausted to ask follow-up questions about his day. Our romance, the one I thought was built on mutual respect for each other's ambitions, was actually a carefully managed project, where my own success was the very thing that blinded me to his absence. As the night bled into the early hours of the morning, my focus shifted from the when to the why. I began to look at myself through his eyes, not as a lover, but as a resource. I sat back in my chair, staring at my own professional bio and my financial statements. I realized that Marcus hadn't chosen me because of a soul-stirring connection or a shared vision of a family. He had chosen me because of my optimized profile. I was 38, childless by choice, and earning a high six-figure income. I had a clean legal record, a prestigious social standing, and a schedule so packed that I valued my independence as much as my partnership. To a man like Marcus, I was the perfect strategic upgrade. I wasn't just a girlfriend, I was a financial and social insurance policy. By marrying me, he would secure a legal wife who provided him with a respectable front for his professional circles, someone who could co-sign for high-end real estate and bolster his credit rating. He didn't want a partner to grow old with. He wanted a partner whose assets would fund the retirement of the man he was in that other life. I realized with a sickening clarity that I was the one who was supposed to bankroll the quiet suburban future for the woman and children he had hidden away. My independence, the very thing I was most proud of, was the tool he used to keep me at a distance. He didn't have to worry about me being clingy or suspicious because he had selected a woman whose life was already so full that she wouldn't notice the hollow spaces in his. I was a high-yield investment that required very little maintenance, a strategic asset designed to provide him with maximum return on his deception. I picked up the photographs the grandmother had left on my desk. I looked at the woman in the pictures, the one who lived in the blue house with the creaky step. She wasn't the young, vibrant, other woman trope I had seen in movies. She looked tired. Her clothes were practical. Her hair pulled back in a hurried knot, and her eyes held the weary, haunted look of someone who had spent a decade living on promises. She was a devoted mother, a woman who had clearly poured every ounce of her spirit into raising 3 children in a state of perpetual waiting. Marcus had kept her in a world of domesticity and legacy, promising her a future together that never seemed to arrive while he kept me in a world of stability and status. We were both being farmed for different resources. He took the emotional labor, the children, and the domestic warmth from her, and he took the prestige, the financial power, and the social elevation from me. He had divided his life into silos, ensuring that neither of us could ever see the full picture. She was his past and his secret heart, and I was his future and his public face. He had constructed a world where he could have everything without ever having to sacrifice anything. He was a predator who didn't hunt for sport. He hunted for infrastructure. He had surveyed the landscape of his life and identified exactly what he was missing: legal standing and financial security, and he had scouted me as the most efficient way to acquire them. The more I analyzed the data, the more the pain of the betrayal was replaced by a cold, burning sense of insult. I wasn't just a woman whose heart had been broken. I was a professional whose life had been hacked by a sophisticated social engineer. I had been audited and found to be the most profitable path for his survival. The realization was a turning point. The Denise who had been excited about a wedding 3 weeks away died in that chair, replaced by a woman who saw the world in terms of vulnerabilities and leverage. I looked at the engagement ring on my finger, its diamond reflecting the cold blue light of my computer screen, and I saw it for what it truly was: a down payment on a fraudulent contract. Marcus hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't fallen out of love or gotten carried away. Every move he had made from the first date to the proposal had been a calculated step in a long-term plan to secure his own comfort at my expense. He had banked on my busy life and my trusting nature to keep the gears of his double life turning. He thought he was the architect of this grand design and that I was merely a resident in the structure he had built. But he had forgotten one fundamental rule of my profession. Once you understand the architecture of a system, you also understand exactly how to tear it down. I sat in the silence of my multi-million-dollar apartment, the city of Seattle waking up below me, and I felt a strange, terrifying sense of calm. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. I wasn't going to be the victim in his story anymore. I was going to be the auditor who brought his entire fraudulent empire to its knees. I wasn't a mistake he stumbled into. I was the strategic solution to a problem I didn't know he had. The cold clarity of my discovery lingered in the air like a winter frost, yet I felt a primal, searing heat rising within me that urged me to pick up my phone and scream until my lungs gave out. My hands hovered over the screen, trembling with the urge to demand an explanation, to shatter Marcus's composure, and to witness the moment his face crumbled under the weight of his own lies. But the seasoned strategist in me, the woman who had navigated 1,000 corporate minefields, forced my fingers to go still. I realized that if I confronted him now, I would be playing exactly the role he had scripted for me. I would be the hysterical fiancé, the emotional casualty he could easily gaslight, discard, or paint as unstable to his colleagues and his other family. If I reacted with fire, I would only be providing him with the smoke he needed to vanish. He had spent 10 years perfecting his defense mechanisms, and an emotional outburst was a frequency he knew exactly how to jam. To win, I had to refuse the script of the scorned woman. I had to become something far more dangerous, a ghost in his machine. I decided then that I would not destroy the other woman's life because she had already been destroyed day by day for a decade. Doing so would only finish the job Marcus had started. Instead of seeing her as a rival to be defeated, I began to see her as the most critical piece of data in the entire system. I would not be an enemy. I would be an invisible ally, a silent observer gathering the fuel for a conflagration he would never see coming. This shift in perspective led me to a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. I reached out to the grandmother and arranged a secret meeting with the woman Marcus called his other life. We met in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of the city, far from the polished glass and steel of my daily existence. When she walked in, the mirror effect hit me with the force of a physical blow. She was soft where I was sharp, her movements hesitant where mine were decisive. She wore a simple cotton dress and looked as though she hadn't slept for a year. As we spoke, I didn't see a temptress or a villain. I saw a parallel version of myself, a version that existed in a world where independence had been traded for the hollow currency of his promises. She told me about the Marcus she knew, the struggling consultant, who worked long hours to provide for his children, the man who was always just one big contract away from finally being home for good. It was heartbreaking to realize that while I was being groomed as his financial powerhouse, she was being farmed for her patience and her domestic labor. She was the one who raised the children he claimed to love but barely knew, and I was the one who provided the prestigious social front that made his life look successful to the outside world. This encounter solidified a resolve in me that went far beyond personal heartbreak. This was no longer just about my broken engagement. This was about the systemic theft of time from two women and the cold-blooded deception of three innocent children who were being used as pawns in his grand design. I looked at her tired face and realized that we were both victims of a predator who didn't just lie. He consumed people's lives to build his own infrastructure. After that meeting, I returned to my apartment and began an exhaustive infrastructure analysis of our lives. I stopped looking at our relationship as a romance and started treating it as a hostile merger. I pulled every document I had, the co-signed investment properties in the city, the shared high-limit credit cards, and the joint bank accounts we had established for our upcoming wedding. I began to map out the structural weaknesses in his two-world system. Marcus's greatest strength was his ability to keep his lives in silos to ensure that the Denise who managed tech projects never talked to the woman who managed his household. He thrived in the gaps between the two realities. But I realized that this separation was also his greatest vulnerability. He had built his entire life on the assumption that these two worlds would never collide, that the legal and financial structures of his public life would never be scrutinized by someone who understood the private costs of his lies. I looked at the LLC he had encouraged me to invest in, realizing now it was likely a funnel for the suburban house's mortgage. I examined the tax filings and the insurance policies, finding the tiny discrepancies that a normal lover would overlook, but a program manager would find glaring. His arrogance was his blind spot. He believed he was the only one smart enough to manage the flow of information. He had left a paper trail of digital breadcrumbs, believing they were buried under the weight of my busy schedule. Every shared asset was a tether, and every legal commitment was a trap he had unknowingly set for himself. I spent the rest of the week acting. When Marcus came home, I wore the designer engagement ring and smiled through dinners discussing floral arrangements and guest lists, as if my heart wasn't a cold stone in my chest. I watched him across the table, his smooth hands, his practiced charm, and felt a chilling sense of detachment. He was a bug in a system I was about to debug. I let him talk about our future, about the stability we were building together, all while I was quietly moving my personal liquidity into private accounts and documenting every penny he had diverted from our joint funds. I wasn't just looking for revenge, I was looking for the precise moment of maximum leverage. He thought he was in control because he was the one with the secret, but the power had shifted the moment I decided to stay silent. By maintaining the illusion of the perfect bride-to-be, I was buying the time I needed to ensure that when the collision finally happened, it would be catastrophic for him and him alone. I was no longer a victim waiting for an apology. I was a strategist waiting for the perfect opening. I realized that the house he had built was a house of cards held together by the very documents he thought protected him. I was the only one who knew where the foundation was cracked, and I was going to make sure that when it fell, there was no way for him to crawl out from the rubble. If I burned his house down now, I'd be a criminal. If I waited, I could make him light the match himself. In the days that followed my secret meeting with the woman who lived in the shadow of my life, I mastered the most difficult role I had ever played. I leaned into the performance of the perfect high-achieving bride with a terrifying level of precision, transforming every dinner and every wedding planning session into a masterpiece of misdirection. I smiled, more often laughed at Marcus's jokes with a little more warmth, and deferred to his opinions on everything from the reception lighting to the vintage of the champagne. I could see the effect it had on him. He began to move through our apartment with a renewed sense of arrogance, his chest puffed out as if he had successfully conquered the most difficult challenge of his life. In his mind, I was already won. He believed that his two worlds were finally in perfect alignment, one for the quiet suburban comfort he kept hidden, and one for the prestigious, high-powered future I represented. This overconfidence made him sloppy. He stopped clearing his browser history with such vigor, and he began taking calls from his consulting clients in the other room without checking if the door was fully latched. He was so drunk on his own perceived cleverness that he started believing his own lies, convinced that he was the grand architect of a deception so flawless that even a woman of my intelligence could never hope to pierce the veil. I watched him from behind my wine glass, a silent observer in my own home, noting every minor slip and every boastful grin. I wasn't looking for a confession anymore. I was looking for the moment he felt so secure that he would walk into the trap I was meticulously setting for him. The opportunity came under the guise of the very thing that defined our public life: financial security and professional due diligence. One evening, as we sat in my office surrounded by the blueprints of our upcoming wedding, I casually brought up the idea of a mutual affidavit of financial disclosure as a supplement to our prenuptial agreement. I framed it not as a gesture of distrust, but as a sophisticated shield for our collective assets. I spoke the language, he understood the language of risk mitigation and wealth protection. I explained that with my upcoming stock options vesting and our joint investments in real estate, we needed a transparent notarized baseline to ensure our tech portfolios were legally impenetrable from external litigation or unforeseen market shifts. I told him that it was about protecting us and our shared legacy, playing directly into his desire for the financial stability I provided. Marcus, believing this was just another example of my hyper-organized PM brain at work, nodded in agreement. He saw it as a tool to lock in his access to my wealth, a formalization of the upgrade he had so carefully engineered. He didn't see the document for what it truly was: a legal noose designed specifically for a man with a secret family. I watched him skim through the clauses, his eyes bright with greed, as he agreed to provide a full sworn accounting of all debts, dependents, and financial obligations. He thought he was securing his seat at the table of my success, unaware that I had already removed the floor beneath it. The document was a masterpiece of legal engineering. I had my personal attorney, whom I had sworn to absolute secrecy, draft it with specific language that targeted material misrepresentation. It required Marcus to swear under penalty of perjury that he had no undisclosed financial obligations to third parties, no children or dependents outside of those listed, and no ongoing ghost debts or support agreements that were not reflected in his official credit profile. On the morning we went to have it notarized, I watched him sign his name with a flourished, confident stroke. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even flinch when the notary asked him to confirm that every statement in the affidavit was true to the best of his knowledge. He looked at me and winked as if we were two partners in crime securing a grand prize. In that moment, he wasn't just catching himself in a lie. He was documenting a crime. By swearing that he had no other dependents while 3 children and a decade-long domestic partnership existed just 2 hours away, he was committing a level of fraud that went far beyond mere infidelity. He was creating a sworn statement that could be used as a primary piece of evidence in a courtroom, a document that converted 10 years of moral betrayal into a black and white legal liability. I smiled back at him, a cold, clinical satisfaction blooming in my chest as I took the stamped and sealed originals. Once the documents were in my possession, I ensured they were immediately filed and backed up in encrypted cloud storage that only I could access. I also had a copy sent to a safe deposit box that didn't bear his name. The legal noose was now tight, and all that remained was for the world to see the truth. Marcus remained entirely oblivious, continuing to play the part of the devoted fiancé, while I quietly moved my liquid assets and prepared the final deployment of our relationship. I had documented every penny he had diverted from our joint accounts to fund his suburban life, and now I had his sworn statement that those payments didn't exist. He had handed me the very weapon I needed to ensure that when his house of cards collapsed, he would have no legal ground to stand on. He wouldn't just be losing a fiancé. He would be facing the consequences of a systemic fraud that he had signed his own name to. The arrogance that had once been his greatest shield was now his greatest weakness, leading him to believe that a signature was just ink on paper rather than the final nail in his coffin. I sat across from him at dinner that night, listening to him talk about our honeymoon in Tuscany, knowing that while he was planning a celebration, I was finalizing a foreclosure on his entire existence. He thought he was signing a contract to secure my wealth. He was actually signing a confession for his own ruin. The morning of the final wedding rehearsal arrived with a sky the color of burnished steel, a perfect reflection of the cold mechanical precision I was about to unleash. Marcus had left early humming a tune as he adjusted his cufflinks, confident that by the end of the day his dual life would be permanently anchored to my fortune. He expected me to meet him at the venue at noon, glowing in white, ready to walk through the final motions of our union. But as he stood at the altar checking his watch, I was miles away watching the first domino fall from the sanctuary of a hotel suite he didn't know I had booked. With a single steady keystroke, I triggered the sequence I had spent weeks preparing. I didn't need to scream or make a scene. I let the systems of the world do the work for me. The first strike was financial. Because of the notarized affidavit of financial disclosure, Marcus had so arrogantly signed the inconsistencies I had flagged to the bank's fraud department were no longer mere suspicions, they were actionable evidence of material misrepresentation for a high-value loan application we had pending. Within minutes, his primary accounts were flagged and frozen for investigation. The LLC he had used as a surgical tool to funnel money from our joint investments to that quiet suburban house was suddenly under a forensic audit I had quietly initiated by reporting irregularities to the state's Corporate Transparency Bureau. The partitions he had spent a decade building the walls that kept his two lives in sterile, separate silos were being torn down by the very institutions he thought he had outsmarted. I watched the notifications on my screen with a detached clinical satisfaction, seeing his digital footprint begin to bleed out. The collision of his two worlds didn't happen in a dramatic bedroom confrontation or a public shouting match. It happened through the cold, inescapable reality of legal documentation. I had ensured that the other woman received a package that morning delivered by a professional courier containing not a spiteful letter, but a copy of the notarized affidavit Marcus had signed under penalty of perjury. She saw the document where he swore to the state that she and their 3 children did not exist as financial dependents. She saw the wedding invitation, the joint asset list, and the cold proof that the man she believed was struggling to provide for them was actually weeks away from marrying a tech executive to secure his own luxury. The fallout was systemic. When Marcus tried to access his cards to pay the rehearsal fees, they were declined. When he tried to call his consultants, he found the woman in the suburban house was no longer waiting by the phone. She was at a lawyer's office using the very documents I had provided to file for an emergency freeze on his remaining assets to protect her children's future. The 2 lives he had managed so carefully for 10 years crashed into each other in the lobby of a bank and the hallway of a courthouse. I remained the ghost in the machine, a silent observer of the wreckage. I never lowered myself to engage in his chaos. I simply stood back and watched as the structure of his deception stripped of its financial fuel and its secret foundations began to implode under its own weight. He found me late that afternoon. I had returned to our glass-walled apartment not as a bride-to-be, but as a landlord reclaiming her space. He burst through the door, his face pale, his expensive suit rumpled, and his eyes frantic with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He looked like a man who had been caught in a landslide he didn't see coming. He demanded to know what was happening, his voice cracking as he asked why the accounts were frozen and why the woman from his past was suddenly threatening him with a lawsuit that mentioned my name. He wanted an explanation for why I was destroying him, his hands shaking as he reached out toward me. I remained calm and seated in my favorite armchair, the one that looked out over the Seattle skyline. I didn't flinch, and I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him with the same dispassionate gaze I used to evaluate a failed software launch. I told him quite simply that I hadn't destroyed him. I had merely stopped helping him maintain the lie. I had stopped being the silent benefactor of his fraud and the unwitting financier of his parallel life. I explained that the system was merely reacting to the truth he had documented with his own hand. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. I only gave him the reality of his own choices. I was the auditor, and the audit was now complete. The finality of the moment was absolute. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder containing the finalized legal paperwork that severed every remaining tie between us. It included a rescission of our joint investment agreements, a formal notice of my intent to sue for the return of the diverted funds, and a demand for his immediate vacation of the premises. I handed it to him across the coffee table, a bridge of paper that led only to his ruin. He looked at the documents, then back at me, finally realizing that the woman he thought was a strategic upgrade had actually been his greatest liability once she stopped believing in him. He had banked on my busy life and my trusting nature, never imagining that the very skills that made me successful, my attention to detail, my risk management, my ability to see the architecture of a complex system, would be the very things that dismantled him. He was left standing in the center of the room, a man with no credit, no assets, no home, and no family left to run to. The quiet suburban dream and the prestigious tech power couple life had both evaporated in the span of a few hours. I watched him realize that there was no way to gaslight his way out of a notarized confession or an institutional audit. He was a man who had lived by the system, and now he was being crushed by it. He lost his status, his money, and both his families in a single afternoon, and I never even had to raise my voice. In the weeks following the silent implosion of Marcus's empire, a profound stillness settled over my apartment, a quiet that bore no resemblance to the hollow silence of a life being lived in the dark. I returned to my space each evening, watching the familiar Seattle fog roll over the bay, and I noticed that the very air felt different. It felt clean, stripped of the heavy, invisible layers of deception that had once permeated every corner of my home. The Italian leather sofa, the glass-walled views, and the designer lighting were no longer the set pieces of a perfect life. They were simply the surroundings of my own choosing. I spent a great deal of time reflecting on the nature of what had occurred, and I realized that I didn't feel like a victor standing over a fallen enemy. I hadn't won a war because a war implies two sides fighting for a territory. Instead, I had simply exited a game that I had never agreed to play in the first place. My sense of success didn't stem from Marcus's misery or the fact that his name was now synonymous with disgrace in our professional circles. My success was defined by my regained agency. I had taken back the narrative of my own life, reclaiming the resources and the time I had unwittingly allowed him to harvest. The peace I felt was the quiet satisfaction of a life finally built on the bedrock of truth rather than the shifting sands of a man's strategic lies. I had traded the illusion of stability for the reality of self-governance, and in the new quiet of my existence, I found a level of contentment that no high-yield investment or prestigious marriage could ever provide. As I restructured my own world, I remained acutely aware of the collateral damage Marcus had left in his wake. While I had the professional skills and the financial cushion to absorb the shock, the woman in the suburban house and her 3 children were in a much more precarious position. I had honored the grandmother's plea in a way that Marcus would never have understood. I didn't reach out with pity, but with the same calculated efficiency I used for everything else. I used my influence and my legal team to ensure that the diverted funds I had recovered from Marcus's frozen assets were diverted once more not into my own pockets, but into legally protected educational trusts for his 3 children. I made sure these funds were shielded from his mounting list of creditors and the impending bankruptcy proceedings that would follow his fraud investigation. I transformed a story of systemic betrayal into a story of quiet restitution, ensuring that the innocent wouldn't be crushed by the inevitable fall of their father. I never sought a thank you from the woman who had lived in the shadows. Our shared history was enough of a bond. By securing the children's future, I was effectively erasing the last of Marcus's leverage. He had used those children as a reason to lie, and I used them as a reason to ensure he could never hurt anyone again. It was a legacy of protection that turned his greatest deception into the only good thing that would survive his name. I often caught myself looking at my reflection in those vast glass walls, searching for the woman I used to be. I saw someone who was undoubtedly older and perhaps a bit more guarded, but I also saw someone who was fundamentally unburdened. The exhaustion that had once been a permanent fixture of my successful workday had vanished. I realized that my true upgrade in this entire ordeal wasn't a more honest husband or a larger penthouse. It was the realization that I am my own most reliable partner. I had spent so long looking for a peer, someone who could match my ambition and my status, that I had forgotten that the most important alliance I would ever form was with myself. I had survived a sophisticated social engineering attack, not because I was a victim, but because I had the internal infrastructure to withstand the collapse. I walked through the rooms of my apartment no longer seeing a half-finished story of a power couple, but a completed masterpiece of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. I had faced the wreckage of my future and found that the foundation was still mine, and it was stronger than I had ever imagined. Bitterness is a heavy weight, and I chose not to carry it. When I thought of Marcus, I didn't feel the sting of a broken heart. I felt the detachment of an engineer looking at a faulty component that had been successfully replaced. He was a man who believed that people were resources to be managed, and in the end, he had been managed by the very systems he tried to exploit. I walked away from the ruins of our engagement with cold, clear eyes, realizing that the greatest gift the old woman had given me wasn't just the truth about Marcus, but the truth about my own strength. I had been audited by life, and I had passed with a level of integrity that he would never understand. I stood on my balcony, the wind carrying the scent of the sea, and I felt a sense of freedom that was absolute. I was no longer a secret, no longer a benefactor for a liar, and no longer a pawn in someone else's logistical nightmare. I was Denise, 38, successful and entirely whole. I had finally stopped looking for someone to complete the picture and started realizing that I was the one who held the brush. The story of Marcus was over, but the story of my life was just beginning to find its true rhythm. I didn't win because I was smarter or more vengeful. I won because I finally stopped volunteering to be his best-kept secret. This journey from being a blind benefactor to a woman of reclaimed power has taught me that true justice doesn't always come with a shout, but through the quiet strength of the truth. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own worth, please subscribe to our channel to join a community of strong, independent women who refuse to be silenced. We believe every story of resilience deserves to be heard, and your support helps us bring more of these powerful narratives to life. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you believe Denise was right to protect the children of the man who betrayed her, or should she have walked away entirely? Many of our viewers have shared that the most satisfying part was seeing a high-stakes liar trapped by his own legal greed, while others felt the silent alliance between the two women was the real masterpiece. What is your take on this calculated revenge? Your opinions drive our conversation and help others find the courage to face their own shadows. Thank you for watching until the very end and for being part of a space where we celebrate the ultimate upgrade, the realization that you are your own best partner.